All right, let's jump into another deep dive. This time, we're going exploring something pretty different. British aristocracy.
Grounds, castles.
Exactly.
Hmm.
But there's a lot more to it. We're looking at this deep dive based on one source, and it was originally a lecture, an informal lecture given in Chinese.
That's pretty interesting in itself to be able to see British aristocracy from a different angle, not just the traditional Western perspective.
Yeah. And we're going to really break it down, all the different levels and how you climb that ladder. Even some surprising facts about, like, dukes and, how they live today.
Yeah. People might be surprised to learn that, British aristocracy has really had to change a lot to keep going today.
Right. It's not just fancy parties and big estates.
Yeah.
Well, maybe a little bit, but definitely more to it.
Yeah.
Where do we even start with something like British nobility?
Well, our source kind of starts by breaking it down, the structure. And it turns out it's not just one big system. There are actually 5 different tiers. You've got English, Scottish, Great British, Irish, and United Kingdom nobility.
5 tiers. Okay, now we're getting into it. Why so many?
Well, it's all about history and politics. Each tier represents a different time period. Like Irish nobility, they're a little bit lower historically, probably because of tensions in the past.
So there's a whole history kind of woven into it. That makes sense. But what about the House of Lords? How does that fit in?
Right, so the House of Lords is the upper house of the British Parliament. And traditionally, you could only be a member if you were an aristocrat. That's how much power they used to have. Now it's changed a bit, but still a key part of the system.
So basically, that's where they had their power. Got it. But let's say someone wants to join this exclusive club. How do you actually climb the ranks of British nobility?
Okay, well, there are a few ways. Our source talks about this knightly path. Now, knighthood itself, it's not technically an aristocratic rank, but it's a really big honor, and it can be a way into the world of nobility.
So it's kind of like honorary membership.
Exactly. Historically, you'd become a knight through military achievements, but nowadays it's more about what you do for your country, like contributions to culture, sports, the arts, even philanthropy.
So less slaying dragons, more doing good deeds. That makes sense. But what about those fancy titles like Sir and Dame? Do you get those with any kind of knighthood?
Not with every kind, no. Sir and Dame, those titles are for knights who got there through the Order of the British Empire, and that's a specific order, and it has 5 different classes.
So even within knighthood, there's a whole ranking system.
Right. But basically, only the top 2 classes, those get you knighthood and those titles. GBE, that's Knight, or Dame Grand Cross, and KBE Knight, or Dame Commander.
So it's like the top of the top. Are there any famous people that we might know who have a KBE?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Li Ka-shing, the businessman from Hong Kong. Charles K. Kao, they call him the father of fiber optics. And even Bill Gates for all his philanthropy work.
Bill Gates is a knight. I had no idea.
It is a bit surprising, yeah. But the KBE, it can be given to people outside of Britain, too, especially those who are really influential within the Commonwealth. So Bill Gates, with all he's done, it makes sense.
So it's not just about being British, it's about impact. That's actually pretty cool.
Right. And it's not just business and tech. Akio Morita, the Sony guy, and Charlie Chaplin, the actor, they both received KBEs, too. But Jackie Chan, he has an OBE Officer of the Order of the British Empire, so that's a few ranks below. So there's like a whole range of achievements that are recognized within this order.
Wow, so many different ways to be recognized. But is knighthood hereditary? Like if Elton John is Sir Elton John, would his kids inherit that?
That's a really important point. Knighthood, it's for life, but it's not passed down. So Elton John gets to be Sir for life, but his kids won't automatically be Sir or Dame.
Okay, no Sir Zachary John running around then.
Yeah.
Got it. So we've talked about knighthood, which is like the entryway into this whole nobility thing.
Yeah.
But what's the next step up?
Above knighthood, you've got a baronetcy. That one is hereditary, unlike knighthood, but it's still below the peerage, which is where the real heart of British aristocracy is.
Baronetcy. That's a new one. Sounds a bit made up. Where did that even come from?
It's a bit of a strange one, historically. It started back in the 18th century. The Scottish military, they needed money, so they basically let wealthy landowners buy these hereditary titles that they could pass down to their families.
Pay to play for a fancy title. Huh. I wonder if they took credit cards back then.
Probably not. But the funny thing is, there are still about 700 baronets in Britain today, all descended from those original landowners. So even though it started in kind of a weird way, these titles have really stuck around.
Talk about an investment that keeps on giving. Okay, so we've got knights, we've got baronets, but I'm ready for the main event. Let's talk about the peerage. Now we're talking Jane Austen territory.
Okay, now we're getting to the core of it. The peerage has 5 ranks. You start with Baron, then Viscount, Earl, Marquess, and at the very top, Duke.
Ah, dukes. Knew we'd get there. But what actually separates these ranks? Is it just how fancy the title sounds?
Traditionally, it was all about how much land you owned. Each rank got a certain amount. Barons, they got like 100 acres, Viscounts 1,000, and so on, all the way up to the dukes, who had tons of land.
So more land equals higher rank. It's all about real estate.
Yeah, that was the old system. But things have changed, like the Rothschild family. They're modern barons, but they didn't inherit a bunch of land. Their title is about their money, their financial power.
So it's not just acres anymore, it's about influence. Makes sense for today.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated. You also have non-hereditary baron titles given to people who are important to the government, but they're not traditional aristocrats. It makes the system a bit more flexible, recognizing people for what they do, not just their family.
The system's evolving. Interesting. But what about those higher ranks like Earl, Marquess, Duke? Is it always the oldest son that gets the title?
That's where it gets tricky. With the lower ranks, Baron and Viscount, yeah, it goes straight to the oldest son when the father dies. But with the higher ranks, starting with Earls, it's not that simple.
More complicated. How so?
Well, those higher ranks, sons can actually inherit secondary titles while their dad is still alive. So you can have multiple nobles in the same family, each with their own title.
Whoa. It's like a family business, but with nobility. The CEO, the CFO, everyone gets a cool title.
You could say that. And it leads to some interesting situations, like Winston Churchill. He was born into a duke family, but he was the third son, so he knew he wasn't getting that main title. So he went and did his own thing and became prime minister.
So maybe being born into nobility kind of pushed him to a different path. That's pretty wild. Okay, I'm ready for the top tier, the dukes. What makes them so special?
Okay, the dukes. They're the very top of the peerage. There are only 24 traditional duke families in Britain, and they're ranked by how old their title is. The older it is, the higher they're standing.
So it's like, who's been here the longest competition? But with, way more prestige and probably better hats. Tell me about these duke families.
Each one has its own story, its own ups and downs. For instance, the Duke of Westminster, he's known for being one of the wealthiest people in Britain, owns a ton of land, especially in London.
A billionaire duke. Now that's a title I wouldn't mind having. But I imagine that kind of wealth comes with its own problems.
Oh yeah, for sure. Taking care of all those historic estates, that's super expensive. And then there's the public always watching, always judging everything they do.
Sounds like a bit of a gilded cage sometimes. But what about the other dukes? Are they all landowners and, real estate tycoons?
Not all of them. They each have their own thing going on. The Duke of Abercorn, for example, he's actually related to Princess Diana's family through marriage.
Wow, so they're all connected in ways you wouldn't even know.
Okay.
That's really cool.
It is. And then you've got the Duke of Sutherland. His family has actually had to start selling off pieces of their art collection just to afford the upkeep on their estates. It shows that even being a duke doesn't mean you're immune to money troubles.
It makes you realize that these families, even with all the fancy titles and history, they're dealing with a lot of the same problems as everyone else today.
Yeah.
It makes them a little more human,
Definitely. And speaking of challenges, the Duke of Leinster, he's an interesting one. He actually sold all his ancestral lands because of tax changes, and now he just rents a place to live.
A duke who rents. That's wild. But it shows that even the people at the very top have to adapt sometimes. Okay, so we've got billionaire dukes, art-selling dukes, renting dukes. What else is out there?
Well, you've got the Duke of Wellington, descendant of the guy who beat Napoleon. He's mostly into philanthropy now, using his position to do good in the world.
That's nice. Some of them are using their platform to make a difference. Like they're trying to change what it means to be a duke in this day and age.
Yeah, I think you're right. And then you've got those who are all about keeping up the old traditions. The Duke of Northumberland, his family has traditionally provided the royal butler, and that position gets passed down through generations.
That's amazing. Imagine being that close to the royal family, seeing all that history firsthand. That's quite a legacy. But I'm guessing not every duke family has such a smooth story.
No, unfortunately not. The Duke of Manchester, his family has had a harder time. Over the years, they've lost a lot of their money through bad decisions and scandals. It's kind of a cautionary tale, Even with all the privilege, you can still mess things up.
It reminds you that no matter who you are, there are consequences. Okay, we've covered a few duke families, but I'm curious about this whole network of power and influence around them.
You're talking about things like the London livery companies. They've been a big part of London's economy and politics for centuries. The
Yeah.
Duke of Roxburgh, he's a member of one of those companies.
So it's like this behind-the-scenes network of powerful people, but with a lot more history and tradition.
Yeah, pretty much. And then you have guys like the Duke of Montrose. He doesn't really fit the typical image of a British aristocrat. He speaks Mandarin and even lived in Zimbabwe for a while. Shows you there's a lot of diversity even within this world of dukes.
Okay, I need to know more about this Duke of Athol and his private army. Is that even legal?
It is. He owns the only legal private army in Europe. It's called the Athol Highlanders. Mostly ceremonial nowadays, but still pretty cool.
A private army? That's crazy. And he also runs a tea business. What can't this guy do?
He's a busy guy. And then there's the Duke of Argyll. He makes whiskey, and he's the captain of Scotland's elephant polo team.
Elephant polo. Are you serious? That's amazing. I didn't even know elephant polo was a thing, let alone that a duke would be involved.
It's definitely not your average sport,
Yeah.
but it shows you the kind of unexpected things you find with these dukes.
Okay, I'm officially intrigued. These dukes are full of surprises. But I'm guessing not all of them have managed to hold on to their land and wealth, right?
You're right. The Duke of Buccleuch, he actually lost his title as Europe's biggest landowner recently. Some Danish billionaire bought a huge estate in Scotland and took the top spot.
So even dukes can be outbid. It makes you wonder what's going to happen to all these families and estates in the years to come.
Yeah, it's something to think about. But before we get into the future of the aristocracy, let's hear some more of these Duke family stories. There's still a lot to cover.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready for more.
Yeah, it's like they're each finding their own way, balancing being a duke with being a modern person.
Right. Some sticking with traditions, some trying new things, and some selling paintings to pay the bills.
Speaking of which, our source brings up the Duke of Hamilton, oldest Scottish duke, and his family is still really involved in, like, national ceremonies and legal stuff in Scotland. Shows you they still have this symbolic importance even today.
So even now they represent something important, like about history and heritage.
Exactly. And even those dukes who aren't rolling in money, they're getting creative. The Duke of Rutland, like you said, sold a painting to fix up his castle. But the Duke of Marlborough's family, remember that's Winston Churchill's family, they did things differently. The first duke, he actually started as a knight. Pretty unique.
Wait, so there's hope for us regular folk? I'm kidding. But seriously, knight to duke. That's amazing. And it shows the system isn't totally set in stone.
Yeah. And even within families, there are different approaches. The Duke of Devonshire, he had to deal with huge inheritance taxes, ended up paying them off over 24 years by turning his family estates into tourist attractions.
Talk about turning a problem into an opportunity. Those estates must be incredible to see.
Oh, they are. It shows you, for a lot of these families, it's not just about being rich. It's about preserving their history and letting other people experience it.
That's a really good point. It makes you see these estates differently, not just as, like, symbols of wealth, but places that everyone can enjoy. What about the dukes who aren't so focused on tourism or tradition?
Well, there's the Duke of Bedford. He turned part of his estate into a wildlife sanctuary, protecting endangered species.
Now that's cool. So some of them are using the resources for good, like environmental conservation, like they're stewards of the land.
Exactly. And then you've got the Duke of St. Albans. He lost a lot of land because of taxes, but he's still super wealthy. There's this saying about him, poor, but with lots of money.
Poor, but with lots of money. Yeah, not a bad problem to have.
I guess it all depends on how you look at it, but it shows that even among these dukes, there's a big range of wealth. And speaking of doing things differently, the Duke of Beaufort, he actually made his family fortune even bigger through horse racing and breeding horses.
So he's a duke who knows his way around a stable. Pretty interesting. It seems like these dudes are full of surprises.
Yeah.
Landowners, philanthropists, art collectors, conservationists, horse racing fans. What else?
Oh, and we can't forget the Duke of Grafton. His family has had a lot of tragedy, heirs dying unexpectedly, all kinds of inheritance issues. It's a reminder that even for these aristocratic families, life can be tough.
Definitely. Behind all the titles and fancy stuff, there's still families going through the same ups and downs as everyone else.
Right, and some of these families have surprising interests. The Duke of Richmond, he loves photography and even worked with Stanley Kubrick, the filmmaker. His estate is also where Rolls-Royce has its headquarters.
A duke who's into photography and worked with a legendary director. That's amazing. There's definitely more to these families than you might think.
Yeah, it's cool to see how they balance the old ways with their own passions. And speaking of balancing tradition, we haven't even talked about those who outrank the dukes. The archbishops of the Church of England.
Wait, archbishops are higher than dukes. Now that's a twist. But are they considered nobility?
It's a bit complicated. They're not technically nobles, not in the traditional way, but they do come before dukes in the order of importance. It shows how powerful the church used to be in England.
So not dukes, but above dukes. Hmm, okay. Maybe I'm starting to get this hierarchy thing, or maybe I'm more confused than ever. But it's super interesting.
And then there's the royal dukes. They're a whole other category. Above all other dukes, but below the king or queen.
So like royalty among royalty, the VIPs of the aristocracy. But are all royal dukes equal, or is there like a ranking system?
There is, yeah, based on who they're related to and how old their title is.
So it's not just about being a duke, it's about being the right kind of duke.
Okay, let's hear about these royal dukes. Who's at the bottom of the list?
Okay, so the Duke of Kent, that's Prince Edward, Queen Elizabeth II's cousin. He's sixth in line. He's been a working royal for years, doing public appearances and charity work.
So even being a royal duke isn't all fun and games. There's still work to be done. Who comes after him?
Next up is the Duke of Gloucester, Prince Richard, another cousin of the Queen, fifth in line. He's focused on things like architecture, conservation, international stuff, dedicated to public service, just like the Duke of Kent. Seems like being a royal duke often means giving back.
Yeah, definitely. They pick causes they care about and use their position to do good.
Okay, who's number 4 in this royal duke lineup?
Number 4 is the Duke of York. That one's usually given to the monarch's second son. Right now, it's Prince Andrew.
Prince Andrew, Duke of York. Got it. But wait, what about Prince Harry? He's a duke too, isn't he?
You're right. Prince Harry, he's the Duke of Sussex, and he's actually third in the ranking.
But didn't he and Meghan step back from royal duties a few years ago? Does that affect his title?
Yeah, they did step back, but he still keeps the title. Shows you these titles are really tied to family and tradition, even if you don't want to be part of the whole royal scene.
So it's not just a title, it's part of who he is, his family history. That makes sense. Okay, we're down to the top 2 royal dukes. Who are the big dogs?
Okay, second place is the Duke of Cambridge. That's Prince William. The next king, most likely. That title's a big deal. You know, future monarch and all that.
So not just a title, it's like destiny. So that means Prince Charles, he's at the top of this royal duke ranking.
Exactly. Prince Charles, he's the Duke of Cornwall. That title always goes to the heir to the throne. It's one of the oldest dukedoms, over 600 years old.
Wow, 600 years. That's a lot to live up to. But speaking of old, our source mentioned that the British monarchy is ridiculously wealthy. Do we have any idea just how much money we're talking?
It's a bit of a secret, but people think they're worth about $100 billion.
$100 billion? That's insane.
Yeah.
No wonder they have all those castles and jewels and everything.
Right. It's all tied up in land, property, art, investments. They're one of the biggest landowners in the UK. They own some of the most famous places in the whole country.
It's like they own a piece of British history. But with all these dukes and royalty and all that, it makes you wonder, can a normal person even become a noble these days?
It's almost impossible, at least in the traditional way. Our source pointed out that they haven't given a hereditary peerage to a commoner since 1984.
So unless I'm secretly related to a duke or I invent a time machine and go buy myself a baronetcy, I'm out of luck.
Well, unless you get creative.
Creative. How do you mean?
Remember we talked about micronations? Specifically, Sealand. That little country on that old sea fort.
Oh, right. The Seafort Kingdom. It's not every day you hear about a country run from a military platform in the ocean.
It's a pretty unique story, and it turns out they offer a very unusual way to become a noble.
Wait, are you saying I can buy a noble title from this Seafort? Now, that's what I call creative.
You got it. They sell all kinds of titles. A lordship is like £30, and a dukedom is under 500.
A dukedom for less than £500. That's cheaper than a weekend trip to some places. I can see why people are into this. Has anyone famous actually bought one of these Sealand titles?
Well, apparently Ed Sheeran, the singer, got a Baron of Sealand title as a gift, and he was really happy about it too.
Baron Ed Sheeran of Sealand has a nice ring to it.
Mm-hmm.
And to think, later he got an MBE from the British Empire, but technically his highest title is still the one from that Seafort micronation.
It's pretty funny, right? But it also shows you how much people still care about these titles. Even if they come from unexpected places, there's just something about the idea of nobility that captures our imagination.
Yeah, I think you're right. The history, the tradition, or even just the novelty of it all. There's definitely something fascinating about this world of British aristocracy.
And it makes you think about the role of tradition and hierarchy, you know? In today's world, as we've seen, the British aristocracy is definitely changing, trying to adapt.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to find that balance. keeping their heritage alive, but also moving forward with the times. What do you think the future holds for them? Will these traditions survive, or are they going to fade away?
That's the million-dollar question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. But learning about these systems, understanding how complex and contradictory they are, it helps us think about these bigger questions about history, identity, and the future of tradition itself.
Well said. And it makes you realize even something as old-fashioned as the British aristocracy, it can still teach us about, what it means to be human.
That's it, exactly. History isn't just about dates and events, it's about people, their stories, and how they deal with change.
Wow, we've covered so much in this deep dive. The levels of nobility, the different ways to join this exclusive club, and we've met some pretty incredible dukes along the way.
We've seen how these families are dealing with keeping their heritage going, in today's world, balancing the old traditions with new ways of doing things and finding their place in modern society.
It's been a fascinating journey, really. But before we finish up, there's one thing I keep thinking about. Remember how our source mentioned that hereditary peerages, they haven't been given to regular people since 1984?
Right, it's a good point. The old way of becoming part of the British aristocracy, it's basically gone. Unless you're lucky enough to be born into it, of course.
Which most of us aren't. So what happens to the British aristocracy then? If they're not bringing in any new people, do they just, fade away?
It's a question a lot of people are asking. Historians, people who study society. Some think the aristocracy is becoming less important, like more of a symbol than a real power.
That makes sense. The world is changing, becoming more equal. This whole idea of inherited privilege, it doesn't really fit anymore.
Exactly. And we've seen a lot of aristocrats are changing too, right? Focusing on charity, protecting the environment, or even turning their estates into businesses. It's
Yeah.
different from the old days when their power was all about land and politics.
So they're becoming more like, I don't know, entrepreneurs, public figures?
Yeah, I think so. They have to reinvent themselves, to stay relevant. The world doesn't just hand them power and respect anymore.
It's like they're trading their crowns for business suits.
Uh-huh, kind of. But they've still got all these traditions and expectations. It's tough trying to honor the past and embrace the future at the same time.
Makes you wonder, what will they be like in 50 years? Will they still matter? Or will they be, just a chapter in a history book?
Tough to say. But I think it's safe to say British aristocracy is at a turning point. They need to be smart and adapt if they want to survive.
It shows you that nothing stays the same forever. Even the oldest institutions have to change with the times, otherwise, well, they get left behind.
Absolutely. It's what makes this whole deep dive so interesting. A world full of history and tradition, but also trying to figure out how to exist in the modern world.
Definitely. It's been eye-opening, really. We've learned about, the whole ranking system, these incredible dukes with their surprising stories, even the fact you can buy a title from a sea fort.
Right. And we've also seen what it all means, on a human level. The desire to belong, the weight of family history, the struggle to balance the old and the new.
It's been quite a ride. So what's the takeaway for our listeners? What should they be thinking about?
I think the main thing is even these ancient systems, they're still shaped by people, by the choices they make. The British aristocracy isn't just one thing, it's a bunch of individuals, families, all trying to figure things out in their own way.
That's a good point. It's easy to focus on the fancy titles and all that, but it's the human stories that really stick with you.
Exactly. And that's what keeps it interesting. There's always something new to learn, something that makes you rethink what you thought you knew.
Well said. And to our listeners, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep asking questions, maybe even do your own deep dive into British aristocracy. You might be surprised by what you find.
Who knows? Maybe you'll be inspired to get a lordship from Sealand.
Lord or lady your name. Haha. Has a nice ring to it. But in all seriousness, we hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the world of British aristocracy. Until next time, keep learning, keep exploring, and keep an open mind.